Hello, everyone. It's lovely to be here. So, good evening to everyone who has evening, good afternoon to everyone who has afternoon, and good morning to everyone who has morning. I don't know if any time zone has morning right now, but in case you do, good morning to you as well. Uh, I will maybe skip the introduction because I was already introduced. Maybe just one more thing is that I'm also a member of the Technology Council of Mach Alliance, which is quite a cool organization. I work in the enterprise world, and Mach Alliance is actually something that is very much not enterprising. Like it's like an enterprise organization of the biggest vendors. Like we have, companies like AWS, eCommerce, obviously Vue Storefront, trying to push forward the whole industry and adapt the newest technologies. And it is acting almost like a startup. So it is quite cool. And I want to start this talk by explaining why I think this talk is actually relevant to you, even if you don't work on e-commerce project right now. So if you are still with me, stay with me a little longer. And I will start with this. Like, I don't know if you're aware, but there's an enormous number of e-commerce websites being built every year. And in the last 4 years, it almost tripled. Like the full number of e-commerce websites worldwide tripled. And in 2021 alone, due to the COVID pandemic, the number of e-commerce sites in the world has doubled. So just in 1 year, it doubled. Obviously, that was probably the only budget that was making sense to any kind of company at that time, but still, it is super impressive. And it's safe to say that almost every web developer in our industry will sooner or later have to build some sort of an e-commerce website. Not maybe fully fledged e-commerce, but some sort of e-commerce website. And while in essence, e-commerce websites are built with the same tools and need to follow the same rules as, well, any other website, the industry, the e-commerce industry, it has developed a certain patterns of building them that aim to solve the problems that are very common to almost any e-commerce store. So, there are many e-commerce websites out there, and almost all of them more or less follow the same patterns and unfortunately have the same problems that it's very good to know how to deal with. So in today's talk, I want to share with you the essence of what I have learned in the last 9-ish years in the e-commerce industry. So when the time comes for you to build your e-commerce application, you actually know how to approach it. So also, in case you, by any chance, will never encounter these challenges and you will never experience the joy of building an e-commerce application, you will still learn a lot from this talk, because as I said, e-commerce applications are no different than any other applications. They just share a common set of problems and established solutions, but those solutions, they can be applied really to any application that actually has those problems. So let me start by telling you a story of actually how Vue Storefront was funded and how I get into the e-commerce industry. When I started my journey as a freelancer more than 10 years ago, and I know how it's starting, but it's actually not that long. 10 years ago, I chose the same path as small freelancers at that time, which is WordPress. Right? If you were a freelancer 10 years ago, if you're a freelancer now, you're probably using it. And it was so easy to build things when you were comparing it to just coding them from scratch. You had almost endless amount of plugins, you had endless amount of themes, you had those WYSIWYG builders. It was really, really cool and helpful, especially if you're a freelancer, you want to optimize for time in which you're building something, and this was helping you this tremendously. And as many of you know, WordPress also has an e-commerce plugin called WooCommerce. And it was released in 2011, if I remember right. And it was already quite popular around 2013 when I started taking the first e-commerce projects. And after years of doing things the easy way, I got a little bit bored with WordPress, WooCommerce, and all of this WYSIWYG stuff. I was just tweaking HTML and CSS here and there, rarely writing function in PHP. So I started looking for bigger and more challenging projects. And I knew that I wouldn't be able to get them as a freelancer. This is why I joined the software house as a front-end developer. And that was actually after many years of freelancing. So there I started working with Magento. And if you don't know what Magento is, it was one of the biggest e-commerce platforms at that time, and it was built on PHP. And it was well known from its open source roots, so basically like Vue.js, and a huge, huge international community. You have no idea. There were like Magento contribution days with like 20 people gathering in the room and contributing to Magento like all around the world. And those days were like every week or sometimes even more often. So at that time, there were very little successful open source e-commerce platforms. And the one who were also successful in the enterprise segment, which means that you were dealing with large customers with very interesting problems and projects, you could count on fingers of one hand, really. And I think maybe it was only Magento. But building Magento frontend was all PHP with a sprinkle of jQuery and some other very ancient JavaScript frameworks like Prototype.js. So have a shot if you remember Prototype.js. Nothing very exciting for a front-end developer, but it wasn't a problem very exclusive to the e-commerce space. The majority of big applications look like this at that time. So I was at the job and I started complaining a little bit. And a year later, I mean, I wasn't complaining the whole year, but a year later, I was moved to a different project. And that project was an in-house product. It was actually a SaaS loyalty platform, but it was built with AngularJS. So the PHP backend was built by this company, and the frontend was also built by this company. And this changed everything. Because instead of having to deal with PHP code, jQuery, I was only dealing with the frontend using the hottest at that time JavaScript technologies. I never, ever touched the PHP backend. I had absolutely no idea how it worked. Like APIs were all I needed. And despite having to deal with this new framework and new paradigm, this accelerated my work tremendously and allowed me to focus on the part that I really loved, the part that I really understood, which was the front end, while the other team was also focusing on the thing that they loved, which was backend. So a perfect harmony, you could say. Compared to my experience with PHP e-commerce platforms, it was a whole new level of joy from coding. First of all, the code base was smaller, so I was able to understand it as a whole. Communication with the backend was based on the REST APIs, and it was very elegant. SPA concept introduced by Angular. It made so many frustrating parts of building dynamic UIs that had to update on different callbacks simple and enjoyable. You know it very well, because Vue.js essentially got the same two-way data binding concept as AngularJS used to. And a year or so later, together with my front-end coworkers, we started to wonder if we could have the same experience while developing the e-commerce applications. So still do the things that we love from the industry perspective, but also with the technologies that we love. So, separation of front-end from the backend. It was very beneficial to the velocity of development, the quality of code, scalability of the project, and just pure satisfaction from the process. So we knew that we didn't know much about this thing. So we did an internal evaluation of the available tools like Angular. We looked at React, obviously. We looked at Vue. And I won't spoil much by saying that we choose Vue and built the first e-commerce boilerplate using Magento APIs with this. And as I said, because we had absolutely no idea how to make this right, we decided, okay, we will put this on GitHub. We invite some other agencies from the Magento ecosystem, collaborate on this, and see what happens. And actually, Vue Storefront happened. Like, this is how the first iteration of Vue Storefront came out. At that time, in the world of PHP, separating frontend from the backend was quite an innovative idea, to say at least. And it made a lot of noise in our space, especially among front-end developers. You could imagine, like when you have suddenly an opportunity to work with Vue.js, and you used to work with Prototype and jQuery. So this was 2017. A lot has changed since then. The concept of headless has evolved and matured, and we learned a lot more about it throughout the years. Also, Vue Storefront itself matured a lot. Like today, we are no longer a framework for Magento. We are backend agnostic and support more than 10 e-commerce platforms. We also support React. But yeah, we learned a lot since 2017. And during this talk, I want to actually share with you some of the things that I've learned in the last 8-9 years of working in the e-commerce space almost exclusively with those headless applications. So let's see if I can put all of that in like 30 minutes talk or like 20 minutes, because this is how much we have left. So let's go. And I hope that would be a super condensed knowledge that you'll be able to use in the future. A headless storefront in its core is just an application that communicates with underlying technologies using APIs, instead of performing all those steps required to output the view in a single place, which was usually a backend. And then you were basically calling the database. So in the world of modern JavaScript, this application is almost always based on one of the popular meta frameworks like Nuxt, Next, sometimes even Astro, sometimes Quick, but mostly it's Next and Next. And very rarely you will find applications that use the bare framework without a meta framework, because most of those shops, they are very SEO hungry, I would say. They really live from the SEO. And they need to be SEO friendly, and SSR is a must for that requirement. So that's the first lesson, like use the meta framework. And at this stage, you can say that, your e-commerce application is just a regular Nuxt.js project, and it only grows from there. And the first thing is that most of the e-commerce frontends, they look very similar and contain of the same UI elements, like product cards, mini cards, product sliders, etc. So using a UI library dedicated to e-commerce is a good way to accelerate your work and actually focus on adjusting those things to the branding of your project, instead of thinking about accessibility, performance, like moving the rectangles. You see on the left side, like all of those product cards, the product pages, they are extremely similar. You can basically take the same template and just adjust it. So this is exactly what we thought at Vue Storefront. So 2 years after releasing the first version of it, we released our own UI library, Storefront UI. And since 2019, it was completely rewritten to Tailwind, and now also supports React and Quick. So you can check it at docs.storefrontui.io, or you can also go to GitHub, give a star if you like it. And what makes it unique is that the components are not abstracted. What I mean by that? You literally copy and paste the source of the components into your project, and from there you can customize any aspect of it. And based on my experience, it is much better to accelerate the UI than shipping component abstractions that are quite hard to customize further than any basic use case, like changing colors or changing the fonts. The previous version of Storefront UI was doing that, and honestly, there are only problems with this. And I think Tailwind is actually allowing this use case, and it's an absolutely amazing selling point for any UI library that is using Tailwind. And I think using Tailwind under the hood and abstracting components, I just don't think this is a good idea, but we can have different opinions on that. So you can install Storefront UI in your project simply by adding a Nuxt module that extends your baseline Tailwind configuration with some additional colors and properties, and add some reusable components available from the package. So imagine that we have to copy a very big component that has some other components inside of it, like buttons or toggles, this sort of things. So those components we actually have inside the package, but you can still get a source of them and modify it if you need. And don't get scared with that configuration, because if you're already using some other pre-made Tailwind components like Flowbyte, for example, Storefront UI will work great with them. We don't alter configuration, we extend the configuration. And for simple projects with relatively low traffic, having a dedicated UI library is often enough to cover most of the e-commerce needs. Like you have something that is accessible, that looks great, that is performance friendly, that is consistent. And once the UI is done, you connect it with your e-commerce platform APIs. And it's usually happening through some dedicated JavaScript SDK. And that's it. And honestly, if you have a simple project, don't let anyone tell you that you need more at this point. Like premature optimization is absolutely pointless here, unless you're expecting a huge growth in complexity in a very short time. But then it's not premature, because everything that you learn from there is actually complicating things a little bit. So things are getting much more interesting when you need to ship something more complex than a simple storefront with 1,000 monthly visits connected to like 1 or 2 third-party services. The first challenge is handling bigger traffic. So if you don't want that to be associated with a linear growth of your costs, and sometimes also problems with your infrastructure and performance, because you could have, for example, a memory leak, you're probably going to invest into either caching your SSR responses or just SSG. In both cases, you will put that in the CDN. And in both cases, you'll deal with a problem of session-specific content. Because you see, modern e-commerce applications, they have a lot of session-specific content. At best case scenario, it's like a user profile, card, some mentions of the username. That's it. In the worst case scenario, almost all the content is personalized for the user by some third-party tool that tracks their behavior, collects information, adjusts the layout and content of the application to the user who is browsing it. And to make caching effective, you cannot cache this session-specific personalized content. Otherwise, part of the UI for one user could be cached and shown to the other users, which is, first of all, terrible UX, but often can even break the application in a completely unexpected way, which obviously is also terrible UX. So, by the way, I wrote a quite long article on that topic. It is for Nuxt too, but all the knowledge applies to Nuxt 3 as well. And I think code snippets will also work, though there are some more, I would say, sophisticated ways of dealing with that in Nuxt 3. So today I will keep it super short. The first thing you need to do is making sure that your session-specific content is rendered only on the client side. Therefore, it is not cached. Everything which is rendered on the server side will be cached. And Nuxt actually comes with two great features for that. Client-only component, as the name suggests, will render the wrapped elements only in the browser, which is the client. And if you wrap all the session-specific elements with it, half of your work is done. And I will tell you why only half. This could unfortunately lead to some issues with layout shifts. So when the page is loading, this element is not yet rendered. Your layout could shift a little bit to the bottom, for example, to make space for this particular element. And when we care about good performance, there is a metric called cumulative layout shift, which is actually core web vital, which is actually impacting SEO. So you should avoid layout shifts for great UX, but also because it will impact your SEO. So it's a good practice to render placeholders from the server, so your users know that they should expect something to appear, and this way you will also avoid layout shifts. Here you can see a real-world example of using placeholders on some older version of LinkedIn. You also see this on Facebook and pretty much all over internet. I don't think I need to explain you what a placeholder is. Obviously, Nuxt is not disappointing us here, and it has a built-in mechanism for providing placeholders for this client-only content with a fallback slot. So what you put in a fallback slot will be actually rendered on the server side. This way, we can very easily add a placeholder to each client-side rendered component without doing some nasty tricks. The second thing we need to take care of is data. And I don't know if you know this, but Nuxt is actually saving the data rendered on the server side in the HTML file that it is sending to the browser to not fetch it again. And you will see it at the very bottom when you inspect the SSR output. So we also need to keep this part clean because it also can be cached accidentally. And luckily, Nuxt is also not disappointing us here as well. useFetch, which is commonly used to fetch the data, has a built-in property called server that you can set to false. And this way, the content will be fetched only on the client. It also has a property called lazy, which is quite cool because if you have a secondary personalized content, you can also add a property lazy, and it won't impact the rendering the view. And to test the SSR output, I think the easiest way is you just disable JavaScript in the DevTools. So this way you will see exactly what will be cached, unless you have some kind of edge personalization, but let's assume you don't, and you probably don't. And preparing for bigger traffic is not the only challenge that you will encounter when scaling your e-commerce application, because another one is data, like data as a whole. Large e-commerce applications consume a lot of data and a lot of APIs. And this introduces a lot of new potential problems that need to be dealt with to keep the application scalable and basically clean, the code clean. First one is performance. So usually when you're fetching the data from multiple sources, each of the services that you're using, like Storyblok, Shopify, whatever, is consumed through some kind of dedicated JavaScript SDK. And each of them is adding a few dozen or often even a few hundred kilobytes to your bundle. Like, believe me, those SDK, they can be pretty heavy. So we are obsessing about, like, if Vue.js is adding 10 or 20 kilobytes at the startup, or Nuxt.js is adding 100, but we're not even blinking an eye when we're adding like 200 kilobytes SDK to our application. This way, by adding multiple SDKs like that, you can very quickly make your application clunky and very slow, even before adding any business logic to it. So at the startup, it is slow, and whatever you do later, it is just becoming more slow. The last reason is the business logic that you need to write to federate, orchestrate, and transform the data. Now, an explanation of what does it mean. Data federation is when we need to concatenate multiple APIs to get a full set of data for a given feature. For example, you can fetch price and product name from e-commerce platform, but you take the product description from a CMS. As a whole, they are needed for a product page. Data orchestration is when we need a sequence of API calls to happen, and the result of which is depending on the previous one. So we're making the first call, then we're making another call using the result of the previous call, etc., etc. And you will hear those terms very often in the e-commerce industry and related to e-commerce problems. So doing that, so data orchestration, data federation, but also data transformation on the front end is generally an anti-pattern on the large-scale e-commerce websites, because you're not only increasing your bundle size with all the code and libraries needed for that to happen, like Lodashes of this world, but also potentially increase the HTML file rendered on the server with this irrelevant data, which is commonly known as overfetching. Because you might be, fetching like the whole object and then needing to display 5 properties on the front end. And as we know, all of this data is added to the HTML file. And believe me, sometimes it can be huge, especially when you deal with a lot of data. Not to mention that if you need that to be available in some other front ends or a mobile application, it will actually duplicate all this, orchestration, federation, transformation code. So when you deal with multiple APIs and a large amount of data, it is actually best to delegate this task to a separate middle layer and send to the front end only the data that it needs without exposing the underlying complexity. And this additional layer is usually called an API gateway. So it gets the data from all the underlying APIs, orchestrates them, tough word, orchestrates them if needed, federates them if needed. And the front end now only needs to talk to one service, which is the API gateway, install one SDK, and is completely unaware of anything that is happening underneath. So we also have a very nice separation of concerns, because at least I believe front end should be mostly for the UI. All the business logic, it should happen elsewhere. And at Vue Storefront, this layer is called Vue Storefront Middleware, which is a pretty descriptive name. And it is quite that simple to install. Like, you literally need one file to create a middleware server. And once you run it, it's there. And once the server is installed, you create a middleware config file, which is actually the only file you need to deal with. And when you want to add a new third-party integration to it, and we have plenty of those available, you can check on our website, you just simply add it under the integration field, and that's it. You can also extend each integration, you can provide some configuration, you can override the API endpoints, like, we can do a lot. But in essence, like, once you add it to this integrations field, you can query it from the front end, and the responses will go through the middleware. And as I mentioned, middleware has a very friendly extendability system that allows you to override existing endpoints, hook into some actions, create new ones. It is super handy for data federation and orchestration use cases that I was mentioning before. And you remember this first use case that I was mentioning, when you need to glue the data from the e-commerce and CMS. So in this example, we see that we shipped an extension that exposes new get PDP endpoint, which is product details page endpoint, which is like a product page. And it concatenates the product data from SAP Commerce with its descriptions from Commerce Tools. By the way, we also ship an SDK for the front end that allows you to even easier connect with the middleware and to fetch each endpoint as a fully typed function. I think it's quite cool. You can just fetch the data from the middleware as endpoints as well, but SDK gives it a little bit of superpowers. And yeah, I see that I also made a mistake on this code snippet. And that would cover the key things to know about building complex e-commerce projects, really. To summarize, the absolute essence of this talk, when you're building e-commerce storefronts, think about accelerating your work with UI libraries, because e-commerce UI are extremely repetitive, and you will be just wasting your time if you're doing this from scratch. Secondly, when you're dealing with something that has a little bit larger scale, and when you want to cut on costs, remove session-specific content from your SSR output, otherwise your caching will fail. The third thing is fetch data and perform data-related operations on a separate layer, which is an API gateway. Also, in Nuxt, you can use API routes for that. And of course, like this could be a full day masterclass and workshops. Maybe I will do one at some point somewhere. But if you get those 3 things right, every other mistake that you will make won't cost you that much. Believe me, like I've seen hundreds of e-commerce websites from our customers, from our competitors. And those are things that could cost you a lot. So I hope you remember that when you will encounter your next e-commerce project, and also when that happens, we'll also give Vue Storefront a try. Thank you. You can read more about Vue Storefront in our documentation. You can follow me on Twitter. I post about e-commerce. I post about performance. And I'm also posting some memes occasionally. I hope you enjoyed this talk. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. All right. We do have a few questions for you, Philip. Let's see. First one, in the real world, what tools and techniques do you rely on to monitor and optimize storefront performance in a headless environment?
Oh gosh, like I had a 30-minute talk about that, but I will try to keep it short. So first of all, don't use Lighthouse. Lighthouse is completely useless for like a real world. For the real world, you can look at RAM data, which is real user monitoring. This is the easiest accessible data that you can see on PageSpeed Insights. You can also get it from Chrome User Experience Dashboard. If you really need more insights into like what is happening, you can install Sentry, for example. And at Vue Storefront, we also have our tool, which is called Console, and it's also like monitoring the performance of your application. So things like that. Just not Lighthouse. Like always look at the real world data and always monitor the metrics that are related to Core Web Vitals or just only Core Web Vitals.
Good to know. Thank you. Are there any potential downside or trade-offs to consider when choosing headless architecture for a storefront compared to traditional approaches?
Yes, actually many. Like headless is just one of the architectures, and like there is no golden bullet. Like there's no best architecture in the world. Sometimes monolith is the best thing you can do. And like at the beginning of the talk, I was mentioning about some obstacles that we had, for example, like related to developer experience. If you're a front-end developer, if you don't want to deal with PHP and this sort of things, if you don't know those languages, you can just use headless architecture and connect to the backend with APIs and like never deal with that, for example. But in other cases, like headless is generally built for scale. Headless is generally built to overcome some limitations usually related to the user interface of your current e-commerce platform. Like, for example, you could have an e-commerce platform that has a very limiting or just frustrating templating engine that is disallowing you to build the UIs that you want. Then you can use headless. But it also has, downsides. The first downside is that you need to deploy 2 applications, right? So There are no silver bullets. I would definitely consider headless only if you're not happy with your monolithic setup.
All right, thank you. Um, all right, so how does Vue Storefront handle security when it comes to integrations with payment gateways, shipping providers, and other third-party services?
Oh, that's a quite long topic. Like, how do we handle security in general? Uh, like, in short, I can say that, first of all, like, we are ISO certified and we check all of those things that are needed by ISO 27001 certification. Secondly, we don't need to be a PCI compliant. That, I think, answers the payment gateways, because we're not processing the data, we're just redirecting to the payment gateway. When it comes to the rest, I think, the first sensor is covering this. Like, this could be, when we have customers and they're asking about security, you have to fill a questionnaire that usually has like 200 or 300 rows. So I will boil down my answer to this.
Thank you. That would be a very, very long answer. How does Vue Storefront run on environments such as Shopify
So
in
like
Vue?
with Shopify, you can basically connect to the API and use Vue Storefront. And we used to have an integration with Shopify. It was abandoned at some point. But we have another agency who is building integration with Shopify, and this should be launched, I think, within weeks, because it's already done. We are just reviewing this. So you will have out-of-the-box Shopify integration with Vue Storefront very soon. But in general, like with all SaaS platforms, like we're only able to connect with the API. And that's basically it. Like, you cannot run Vue Storefront within Shopify.
This one definitely leads to the next question about the SDK usage, doing like GraphQL queries in the background. How does it handle deprecation from Shopify?
Thank you, first of all. And yes, so the SDK in general, it needs to handle both REST and GraphQL APIs. So when it comes to GraphQL APIs, we are basically propagating the GraphQL queries. You can pass a GraphQL query to a function. For example, you saw a get product API, but you could also have an API endpoint where you just pass queries. But also you could have some pre-made functions that are actually typed as well. So how does it handle data depreciation from Shopify? You mean, I'm not sure exactly what you mean, but I will assume it. So I will assume like how we are handling a situation when we have some data that is outdated in the Shopify and it's still delivered from the middleware. So middleware is a proxy. It doesn't have a database. So it basically, you have a real-time data. There's no such issue at all.
All right, last question, and thank you for that. Aren't copy and paste components problematic regarding updates, especially with Tailwind?
I love this question, and I will ask you this question: like, do you really need to update your UI library? Like, usually, at least from my experience, the only situation when I needed to update UI library was when there was a bug fix that I wasn't able to fix by myself because it was all a black box and it was abstracted, and I just needed to wait for the update. But usually, when you get UI library into your project, you customize it so heavily that every update almost always ships a lot of breaking changes. And I'm pretty sure that if you ever updated a UI library, like every CSS line change is a breaking change for you. Like, it is pointless. Like, the value from getting this update is just none compared to the effort that you need to make. So it's much better to just copy those components, even if they have bugs. Like, these are the components. You could fix those bugs like within seconds probably, or at worst within minutes. And you don't need to wait for an update, because imagine that, for example, you have a bug in one component and you're waiting for a library update to get a fix. Well, yeah, you got that fix, but you broke also like 90% of your UI, and right now you're spending 2 weeks in updating the library. So what's the point of that? Like, Tailwind UI, I think they're also going a very good direction, and they kind of pave the ways for all the other libraries in that approach, that you just have copy-pastable components. And Tailwind is absolutely amazing at that. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. And that concludes all the questions we had for you today, Philip. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Enjoy the rest of the talks because there is Daniel Rowe coming, if I'm not mistaken, very soon.
Yep, coming soon. Yep, we have one more talk before his.
Yeah, so Daniel is like, you want to see the talk of Daniel. Okay, bye-bye.